Far past the orbit of Neptune, in the cold dark of the outer solar system, a deep space telescope picked up something that should not be there. At first, the scientists at United Earth Space Watch thought it was a fault in the machine. Sensors did not lie, but this reading was too strange to be true. Then more data came in from 3 other stations, and the scientists went quiet. It was real. A fleet of ships, larger than anything humans had ever built, was moving slowly toward Earth. The report reached Secretary General Elena Marsh at 4 in the morning. She read it twice before she let herself believe it. For 12 years, the world had waited for this exact moment. Now it had finally come. Marsh did not go back to sleep. She called for a car and rode through the quiet streets of the city to the council building, where lights were already burning in every window. By the time she reached her office, the halls were full of tired but alert people, all moving fast, all trying not to look afraid. During the short ride, Marsh had looked out at the sleeping city, at streetlights and empty sidewalks, and a single early bus rolling past a bakery just opening its doors. None of these people knew yet. In an hour, maybe 2, every screen in the world would carry the same story, and the quiet, ordinary morning they were having right now would become a memory of the last normal day. Marsh had been a young diplomat 12 years ago, sitting in the back of a much smaller room, while older, more powerful people argued about what to do with wreckage pulled from the Pacific. She remembered thinking, even then, that whatever they decided that year would shape everything that came after it. She had not expected to be the one giving the answer when the day finally arrived. 12 years earlier, a small alien scout ship had fallen out of the sky during a storm over the Pacific Ocean. It was little bigger than a delivery truck, and the pilot inside did not survive the crash. But what that ship carried changed the world. Inside were metals no human had ever seen, computer systems far beyond anything built on Earth, and clear proof that humanity was not alone in the universe. The nations of Earth had a choice to make that year. They could hide the discovery from each other and race to grab the new technology first, or they could share what they had learned and prepare together for what might come next. The argument lasted for months. In the end, cooler heads won. The United Earth Council was formed from that choice, bringing together every major nation under one roof for matters of space and defense. And from that same choice came a quiet, secret program known only to a small circle of people, Project Aegis. The scout ship's wreckage had taught humanity more in a single year than a century of its own research had managed alone. Its hull was built from an alloy no factory on Earth could copy at first, one that turned aside heat and impact in ways that broke the rules of ordinary metal. Its engines ran on principles that took human scientists years just to understand, let alone build. Piece by piece, mistake by mistake, the first scientists on the project had taken that wreckage apart and used it to build something new, not a copy of alien technology, but a foundation for Earth's own. 12 years of careful, secret work had turned one broken ship into shipyards, shield generators, and a fleet that no outsider had ever been allowed to see. Now, 12 years later, the fleet the world had feared and prepared for was finally here. Marsh walked into the main council chamber, where the giant screen at the front showed a slow-moving cluster of lights, still faint, still far away, but growing brighter every hour. Fleet Admiral Jack Ryland stood near the screen, arms folded, watching the numbers update. "Talk to me, Jack," Marsh said. 40 large ships, Ryland said. Maybe more hiding behind them that we can't see yet. They're not moving fast. No weapons fire, no aggressive maneuvers. If I had to guess, I'd say they want to be seen coming. They want us to have time to be afraid. "Are we ready?" Marsh asked, though she already knew what the answer would be. She needed to hear it out loud anyway. "We've had 12 years to get ready," Ryland said. "We're ready." Around the room, other council members were arriving, pulling out chairs, speaking in low voices. Some of them had been children when the scout ship crashed. Others remembered the years afterward, when nobody in the public knew the true reason why every nation on Earth had suddenly agreed to work together, why old rivalries had quietly cooled, why so much money had gone into science and shipbuilding that nobody could quite explain. Only a small number of people in this room, and a few thousand more across the world, knew the real story. To everyone else, It had simply looked like humanity growing up. Outside the council building, and outside every government building on every continent, the ordinary business of the world had not yet noticed anything was wrong. Trains ran on time, markets opened. A boy in Lagos walked to school with his shoes untied. A fisherman off the coast of Japan pulled in his nets and complained about the price of fuel. None of them knew that far above their heads, in the dark beyond Jupiter, something enormous had just come to a stop and was looking directly at their planet. Marsh thought about all of them as she took her seat at the head of the table. Whatever was decided in this room over the next few hours would land on every one of their lives, whether they had voted for it or not, whether they even knew a decision was being made. It was a heavy thought, and she set it aside, because there was no time left for anything but the choice in front of her. Dr. Amara Singh arrived last, carrying a data tablet and looking like she had not slept in 2 days, which was close to true. She was the lead scientist behind Project Aegis, the woman who had spent 12 years turning wreckage from a crashed alien ship into something Earth could use to defend itself. "Report," Marsh said. "Every system is active," Singh said. "Orbital shield platforms are online. The new fleet is fueled and crewed. If they want to talk, we can talk. If they want to fight, we are not the same species we were 12 years ago." A murmur ran through the room. Not everyone in the council fully believed her, even now. Belief was hard when you had spent your whole life assuming humanity was small and alone. 6 hours later, the alien fleet slowed to a stop at the edge of the solar system, near the orbit of Jupiter, and a single ship broke away from the group and began moving toward Earth alone. It was sleek, dark, and shaped like nothing built by human hands, curved and layered like a folded wing. When it came close enough to be seen clearly on Earth's monitors, it sent a signal, translated almost instantly by Earth's own computers, into words everyone in the chamber could understand. "We come in peace, to offer you a place among the stars. We ask only to speak with your leaders." Marsh looked at Ryland. Ryland looked back at her and gave a small nod. There was no point in delaying. Whatever this was, it would happen with or without her permission. "Let them speak," Marsh said. The signal opened into a live image, and for the first time, humanity looked upon a being from another world, speaking directly to their leaders. He called himself Envoy Thal Saren, of a species called the Vantar, and he spoke for an alliance of many worlds known as the Concord. Thal Saren was tall, with smooth gray skin, and eyes that seemed to hold no color at all, only a soft light. He wore robes that looked simple but clearly cost more than anything in the room. When he spoke, his voice was calm and even, the voice of someone used to being listened to. Around the chamber, council members leaned forward without meaning to, blond toward the screen despite themselves. It was one thing to know, in the abstract for 12 years, that humanity was not alone. It was another thing entirely to see it, calm and patient, looking back at them through a screen, as if this conversation were the most ordinary thing in the world. "People of Earth," he said, "for 10,000 years, the Concord has traveled the stars, bringing new worlds into peace and cooperation. We have watched your species grow, since you first learned to send signals into the dark. We have watched you build weapons, and cities, and dreams. Now the time has come to offer you what we have offered many others before you, a place in our great alliance." He explained the offer slowly, as if speaking to children who might not understand at first. Earth would join the Concord. In exchange for guidance and protection, humanity would agree to certain terms. The development of Earth's weapons would be limited and overseen by Concord officers. A share of Earth's resources, its minerals, its energy, even a portion of its food production, would be set aside for the wider Concord network. Earth's fleets would operate only with Concord permission, and only within regions the Concord allowed. In return, Earth would receive access to Concord trade routes, some of their older technology, and what Thal Saren called protection from the true dangers of the void. "Many species have joined us willingly," Thal Saren said, "once they understood what waits beyond your solar system. There are dangers out there that your small fleet could never survive alone. We do not ask this to harm you. We ask it because it is the way all young species must grow, under the guidance of those who came before." He spoke of a world called Ilvan, whose people had joined the Concord 300 years earlier, frightened and alone after their own first contact with raiders from beyond their system. Today, the Ilvani are safe, their skies protected, their world untouched by war, Thal Saren said. This is the gift we offer you. Safety, in exchange for trust. He did not mention what the Ilvani had given up to receive that safety, and on Earth, no one yet knew enough to ask. He paused, and for the first time, something like impatience crossed his face, quickly hidden. No species in 10,000 years has refused this offer. I trust humanity will show the same wisdom. The chamber was silent after the signal cut out, to allow for a response. Marsh felt the weight of every eye in the room turned toward her. He called it cooperation, said one older council member, a woman named Petra Voss, who had been part of the original committee 12 years earlier. But strip away the pretty words, and what is he really asking? Control of our weapons, a cut of everything we produce, permission to move our own ships. That is not cooperation, that is a leash with a bow tied on it. But what if he's telling the truth about the dangers out there, said another member, a man named Halverson, his voice tight with worry. We've seen one crashed ship. We don't know what else is waiting in the dark. Maybe it's better to have a powerful friend than to stand alone and find out the hard way. We are not standing alone, Ryland said quietly. We haven't been alone for 12 years. We've been preparing for exactly this day. A younger member of the council, a former engineer named Chen Wei, who had helped design the first shield platforms years earlier, leaned forward. With respect to Envoy Saren's warnings, we have no proof of these terrible dangers he describes. We have his word, and only his word. A fleet that arrives already prepared to make demands is not behaving like a friend worried for our safety. It is behaving like someone who expects to be obeyed. And if we're wrong, Halverson pressed, if we say no, and the void really is as dangerous as he claims, and we have refused the one hand offered to help us? Then we face that danger as ourselves, Chen Wei said, not as someone else's property. Marsh raised a hand, and the room fell quiet again. She looked at Dr. Singh. Amara, tell them plainly. Can we say no to this and survive what comes after? Dr. Singh set down her tablet. I won't pretend there's no risk, but yes, we built our shields from what was left of that crashed ship, and then we built past it, further than they probably think we could. Our fleet is small next to what we just saw arrive at Jupiter, but small does not mean weak. We are not the species that ship's pilot expected to find 12 years ago. She tapped her tablet, and a simple chart appeared on the wall screen. Rows of ships, shield platforms, and defense stations built quietly across 12 years, spread through every ocean and every orbit, funded by budgets that governments had explained to their own people as anything but what they truly were. They have seen our radio signals and our old satellites, Singh said. They have not seen this. As far as the Concorde knows, we are still the species that built beside the wreckage of their own scout ship. They do not know what those 12 years bought us. Marsh was quiet for a long moment, looking at the still image of the Concorde ship hanging in the dark beyond Jupiter, patient, certain of the answer it expected to receive. I did not spend 12 years building a defense so that I could hand our future to someone else out of fear, she said finally. We say no. Not everyone in the room agreed. Some argued a little longer, worried about the cost of defiance, worried about the unknown dangers Thal Saren had mentioned. But in the end, the vote was clear enough, and it fell to Marsh to deliver the answer. When the signal reopened, Thal Saren's face appeared again, calm, waiting, already certain of what he would hear. Envoy Saren, Marsh said, the people of Earth thank the Concorde for its offer, but we must decline. We do not wish to place our weapons, our resources, or our future in the hands of another power, however wise or well-meaning that power claims to be. We would welcome an equal friendship, trade between us as equals, honest cooperation between two independent peoples. But we will not accept guidance in place of freedom. Earth remains its own. For a long moment, Thal Saren said nothing at all. His calm, practiced expression did not change, but something behind his colorless eyes did, a flicker, like a man who had just been told the sun would not rise tomorrow. In 10,000 years, no species had ever said those words to the Concorde. You understand, he said slowly, what you are choosing. We understand exactly what we are choosing, Marsh answered. Freedom. The Concorde does not ask twice, Thal Saren said, and now there was something colder underneath his careful voice. I hope, for your sake, that your confidence is not misplaced. I will carry your answer to my superiors. What comes next will not be my decision to make. The signal cut out. On the screen, the small dark ship turned slowly and moved back toward the waiting fleet near Jupiter, and for the first time since the alarms had sounded that morning, the chamber was completely silent. Ryland was the first to speak. Well, he said, that's done then. That's begun, Marsh corrected quietly, still watching the screen, where the distant fleet had not moved, had not left, only waited, exactly as it had before. Send the order, full readiness, every platform, every ship. Whatever they decide to do next, I want Earth ready before they do it. Dr. Singh was already reaching for her tablet, already sending the signal that would wake every shield platform in Earth orbit, every ship crewed by 12 years of quiet preparation, 12 years of a secret the world was about to learn all at once. Far beyond Jupiter, the Concorde fleet held its position, patient and enormous, waiting for word from a home far across the stars, where leaders who had never once heard the word no were about to hear it for the very first time. On Earth, as the sun rose over the ocean where the first broken ship had fallen 12 years before, 12 years of quiet work finally stepped out of the shadows, no longer a secret held by a careful few, but the plain and open answer of an entire world that had chosen, with open eyes, to remain free. Far across the galaxy, on a world called Vantar Prime, the message from Envoy Thal Saren reached the Concorde High Council, in the middle of what should have been a quiet, ordinary session. High Chancellor Voss Kethrin read the report once, then read it again, the way a person reads a sentence that does not make sense the first time. Read it to me, Kethrin said to the aide standing beside his chair, though he had already read it himself. He wanted to hear the words spoken aloud, as if that might change them. The aide's voice was careful and quiet. The species designated Earth has declined membership in the Concorde. Envoy Saren reports the refusal was delivered directly by their head of government, in clear terms, without request for further negotiation. For a long moment, nobody in the chamber spoke. High Chancellor Kethrin had led the Concorde Council for 40 years. In that time, 19 new species had been brought into the alliance, some eagerly, some only after long persuasion. A few only after a show of force convinced them that joining was wiser than resisting. Not one of them, in 40 years, had said no. Not one, in the 10,000 years of Concorde history that came before him, according to every record his people kept. The Concorde's reach stretched across more than 600 star systems, an alliance built slowly over 10,000 years through conquest, persuasion, and the occasional careful demonstration of overwhelming force. Its fleets numbered in the thousands. Its member worlds paid tribute in resources, labor, and loyalty, and in exchange received protection from pirates, from rival powers along the border, and from each other. It was, by every measure the Vantar used to judge such things, the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known, and Kethrin had spent his entire life believing that greatness made it, in some fundamental way, impossible to refuse. There must be an error in translation, said Councillor Yarash, an older Vantar, who had served on the council even longer than Kethran. Perhaps their leader misunderstood the offer. Envoy Saren does not make translation errors, Kethran said. He has served this council for 200 years. If he says the answer was clear, then the answer was clear. Around the table, the other council members began to speak at once, their voices rising over each other, a rare break in the calm order that usually ruled Concorde meetings. Some demanded an immediate show of force, a fleet sent to remind this young, arrogant species of its place. Others urged patience, worried that acting too quickly against an unknown opponent might prove embarrassing if handled badly. A few, quietest of all, wondered aloud what kind of species would say no to an offer that every other species in 10,000 years had accepted, and whether that question deserved more thought than anger. Councillor Yarash's own successor, a younger Vantar named Wren, who had never known the Concorde to expand its borders even once in her lifetime, spoke carefully into the noise. "We have not fought a true war in 300 years, Chancellor. Our fleets have grown fat on training exercises and pirate hunts. If this Earth truly built a defense capable of surprising us, a war against them will not be the quick, tidy matter some in this room seem to expect. A few council members shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, but no one argued the point directly, because no one could say for certain that she was wrong. Catherine raised a hand, and slowly, the room came back to order. Whatever the reason, he said, this cannot be allowed to stand unanswered. We do not require Earth's cooperation, because we need anything they have. We require it because a member of the Concord who broke away or refused at will would put ideas into the heads of 19 other species who have not refused, but who might if they saw refusal succeed. That was the truth beneath the anger, and everyone at the table understood it, even if only Catherine said it plainly. The Concord's strength came not only from its fleets but from the simple, unquestioned fact that no one had ever successfully stood against it. If that fact changed, even once, every treaty across 10,000 years of history would suddenly seem less certain than it had the day before. Send a fleet, Catherine said, not our largest. Enough to make our seriousness clear. Enough to frighten them back to the table without a true war, which would cost more than any resource this small, backward world could offer us in return. Let them see what they are refusing, and give them a second chance to reconsider before matters become permanent. Fleet Marshal Draxus Kor, who had said nothing throughout the meeting, finally spoke from his seat near the back of the chamber. He was younger than most of the council, a soldier rather than a politician, promoted quickly through a string of victories against pirate fleets along the Concord's outer border. Give me 40 ships, Chancellor, and I will have their surrender within the month. No species with only 12 years of warning has anything worth calling a defense. See that you are right, Catherine said, because if you are wrong, Marshal, every eye in the Concord will be watching, and not kindly. Draxus Kor did not smile, but something like satisfaction crossed his face as he stood to leave the chamber and begin preparing his fleet. He did not expect a war. He expected, at most, a brief show of force against ships built by a species that had only just learned to leave its own solar system, followed by a quick and grateful surrender once they understood exactly how outmatched they were. He would not learn how wrong he was until it was already far too late to matter. Back on Earth, the secret that had shaped an entire generation was a secret no longer. Within a day of the Council's meeting with Envoy Thal Saren, Secretary General Marsh addressed the people of the world directly. Her broadcast carried into every home, every school, every ship at sea, translated instantly into every language still spoken on the planet. She told them everything: the crash 12 years ago, the wreckage pulled from the Pacific, the choice made in secret to prepare rather than panic, to build rather than wait and hope. She told them about Project Aegis, about the shipyards hidden in plain sight, disguised for over a decade as ordinary industry, about the shield platforms quietly built into orbit under cover of scientific missions, about the fleet crewed and trained in complete secrecy, ready for a day that had finally come. I know, Marsh said, looking directly into the camera, that some of you will be angry we kept this from you. I understand that anger, and I will answer for it when this is over. But I ask you to understand why it was done. A secret shared with 8 billion people is no secret at all. And everything we built so that today, when the moment finally came, we would not be asking you to be afraid. We would be telling you that we were ready. We are ready. And I will not trade the freedom your children will inherit for a false promise of safety handed down by strangers who arrived expecting us to kneel before we had even been asked to stand. The reaction across the world was not calm, not entirely. There was fear, plenty of it, and no small amount of anger at a government that had lied by omission to its own people for over a decade. Crowds gathered outside council buildings on every continent, demanding answers, demanding to know why they had never been trusted with the truth. But underneath the anger, something else began to grow, slowly, over the following days, as more information reached the public: pride. The kind of pride that comes from learning your species had faced the greatest test in its history, and had chosen, quietly and without asking for credit, to prepare rather than despair. In a small kitchen in Nairobi, a mother held her 2 children close while the broadcast replayed on the wall screen, and found herself, to her own surprise, not as frightened as she had expected to feel. In Buenos Aires, an old man who had spent his life certain that governments only ever lied to their people sat quietly through the whole broadcast. Then, for the first time in years, called his estranged son just to hear his voice. In a fishing village on the coast of Vietnam, a crowd gathered around a single television in a tea shop, arguing loudly about what it all meant, but no one left, and no one looked away. Fear moved through the world that day, but so did something steadier underneath it, something that would take root over the following days, as photographs of the hidden shipyards began to circulate, and the scale of 12 quiet years became impossible to deny. Shipyards that the public had believed were building ordinary satellites and cargo vessels were revealed to have spent a decade constructing something else entirely. Ships built along coastlines and in orbit above every major nation, built from alloys refined using techniques drawn from 12 years of study, armed with weapons that human engineers had built past what the original wreckage had ever contained. The public learned the names engineers had used quietly among themselves for years: Guardian-class cruisers, built heavy and layered with shielding, meant to shrug off impacts that would have destroyed an ordinary hull; Sentinel platforms, silent defense stations, hidden among what everyone had assumed were weather satellites, each one carrying enough firepower to matter in a real fight; and the small, fast Hawk-class fighters, built for speed and precision rather than size. The world learned, almost all at once, that it had been living inside the largest and quietest cooperative project in human history, and that the people who ran it had never once let that secret slip. Far beyond the orbit of Neptune, Fleet Marshal Draxus Kor stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching Earth grow slowly brighter on the forward display as his fleet closed the distance. His second officer, a quiet, methodical Vantar named Kale Doss, stood beside him, reviewing sensor reports. "Their fleet has already moved to intercept us," Doss said. "Formation is tighter than expected for a species with no real combat history." "Formation means nothing without experience behind it," Kor said. "I have beaten pirate captains who drilled their crews for decades and still broke the moment real fire came their way. A parade ground is not a battlefield. And if they surprise us," Kor allowed himself a thin smile, "then I will be the first Concord officer in 1,000 years with an interesting story to tell at the victory feast. But I do not expect to need one. Order the fleet to hold formation. We will make our demand a single time, clearly, and give them the chance to save themselves before we are forced to make an example of them." He said it with the calm certainty of a man who had never once needed to consider what would happen if his confidence turned out to be misplaced. Fleet Admiral Jack Ryland stood on the deck of the flagship Horizon 3 days after Marsh's broadcast, watching new crews board ships that had been built and rebuilt a dozen times over 12 years of testing. Around him, nations that had spent a century arguing over borders and history now worked side by side without complaint, because there was no longer any question about what mattered more. Within the council chamber, leaders who had spent careers competing for influence over one another signed emergency declarations without argument, releasing full command of their national fleets to the unified Earth defense structure that Ryland had spent a decade quietly building. It was, several of them admitted privately, the first time in human history that every major power on the planet had agreed to something so completely and so quickly. Whatever else came from the day the Concorde arrived, it had done in a single week what a century of treaties and summits had never managed. It made the idea of humanity worth more, to everyone, than the idea of any one nation within it. Among the officers reporting for duty that week was a young squadron captain named Mia Torres, barely 30 years old, who had spent the last 6 years flying testing runs for experimental fighter craft that the public had believed were simple research drones. She had never expected to fly them into an actual battle. Standing now on the deck of her assigned carrier, watching her squadron's small, fast ships being fueled and armed for the first time with live weapons instead of training loads, she felt something settle in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but close to both at once. "Word is the Concorde fleet is already moving," said her second-in-command, a quiet man named Osei who had trained beside her for 4 years. 40 ships, maybe more we can't see yet." 40 ships that have never once lost," Torres said, "and us, who have never once fought." "Good thing we've had 12 years to practice for the day we would," Osei said. Torres allowed herself a small smile. It was the kind of thing people said to steady their nerves before a fight, but it also happened to be true, and there was comfort in that. Behind them, the rest of the squadron ran final checks in silence. 12 pilots who had trained together for years without ever fully believing this day would come. A young pilot named Reyes, the newest addition to the squadron, checked her weapons display for the third time in 10 minutes. "You'll wear a hole in that screen before we even launch," Torres told her, not unkindly. "Sorry, Captain," Reyes said. "First real fight." "It's the first real fight for all of us," Torres said. "That's what the last 12 years were for. Trust your training." It was built for exactly this morning. Across the Earth Defense Fleet, similar conversations were happening in 100 different languages, on 100 different ships, among crews who had trained for a moment they never fully believed would come. Now that it had come, there was no more room for doubt, only preparation. Weapon systems were tested and retested. Shield platforms in orbit ran through their final calibrations. Supply ships moved quietly between shipyards and the fleet, carrying the last of what 12 years of secret work had produced. Dr. Amara Singh spent those 3 days barely sleeping, moving between laboratories and command centers, checking systems that had already been checked 100 times before, because there was nothing else useful left for her to do with her hands while she waited. Project Aegis had always been a program built for exactly this moment, and now that the moment had arrived, she found herself oddly calm, the calm of someone who has already done everything she can, and now must simply wait to see if it was enough. She thought often, during those long hours, of the small crash site team from 12 years ago, most of them retired now, or long since passed away, who had first pulled twisted metal from the ocean and dared to imagine it might become something more than a curiosity in a museum. None of them had lived to see whether their gamble would work. She hoped, quietly, that wherever they were, they knew it had. "You should rest," Ryland told her, finding her in the command center late on the third night, staring at a display that had not changed in an hour. "I'll rest after," Singh said. "One way or another, this will be decided soon." She was right. On the fourth day, sensors along the edge of the solar system picked up the signature of 40 large ships crossing the outer boundary near Neptune, moving in careful formation, exactly where scouts had predicted the Concorde fleet would arrive, if it came at all. Alarms sounded across every command center on Earth and in orbit. Fleet Admiral Ryland gave the order that 12 years of preparation had been building toward, calm and clear over every channel at once. All ships to battle stations. This is not a drill. On the deck of her carrier, Captain Mia Torres heard the order and felt the old, familiar readiness take over from the nerves. The same readiness that 12 years of training had built into her without her even noticing. She climbed into her fighter, sealed the cockpit, and watched the launch bay doors begin to open onto the dark of space, where somewhere beyond the edge of the solar system, an enemy that had never lost a fight in 10,000 years was moving steadily closer, utterly certain of the surrender that was about to be handed to it. They were about to learn exactly how wrong that certainty was. The Concorde fleet crossed the orbit of Neptune and kept moving inward, steady and unhurried, exactly as Fleet Marshal Drax's Corps had planned. There was no need to rush. A fleet that had never lost saw no reason to behave as though it might. 2 days after entering the solar system, with the fleet now drifting through the outer edge of the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, Corps sent his message to Earth. It was brief, and it was not an offer. It was a demand. "People of Earth," Corps' voice said, translated instantly into every language on the planet, carried on every channel Earth's own communication network could reach. "You have refused the generous terms offered by the Concorde. I am Fleet Marshal Drax's Corps, and I have been sent to correct this misunderstanding. You have 1 day to send word of your surrender to the Concorde High Council. If no such word arrives, my fleet will destroy the mining station your people have built on the asteroid you call Series 7, as proof of what will follow if you continue this foolishness. Do not mistake my patience for weakness. I have shown you far more patience than most Concorde officers would think to offer a species as young as yours." On Series 7 itself, 200 people heard the same broadcast at the same moment as the rest of the solar system. There was no panic, not exactly, not yet. Evacuation drills had been part of life on every off-world station for over a decade. Quiet routines nobody outside Project Aegis had ever explained the true reason for. Station Chief Naomi Bell gathered her people toward the station's shielded core within minutes of the broadcast ending, calm and practiced, though her hands shook slightly as she counted heads, and though every one of the 200 understood, without needing to be told, exactly how thin that shielded core would prove against a warship if it ever came to that. In the command center beneath the United Earth Council building, Fleet Admiral Jack Ryland listened to the message twice, his jaw tight. Ceres 7 is a mining station, he said. 200 workers, families, a school for the children born there. No weapons, no military value at all. That's exactly why he picked it, Secretary General Marsh said quietly. He wants an easy target, something to break for free, to prove what will happen if we don't kneel. He's not trying to win a war yet, Jack. He's trying to avoid one, on his terms. Dr. Amara Singh stood at the edge of the room, arms folded. Then we don't give him the chance to make his point. Ryland looked at her, then at the display showing the slow, patient drift of 40 Concorde ships through the outer belt, still a full day's travel from Ceres 7 at their current speed. We move to intercept, Ryland said. Full fleet. We don't wait for his deadline, and we don't let him get close enough to that station to make good on his threat. You understand what that means, Marsh said. No more waiting to see what they do. We would be the ones opening fire first. They opened fire the moment they threatened 200 civilians to make a point, Ryland said. I'm not interested in who gets blamed for starting something they already started 12 years ago, the day that scout ship first came looking at us without saying hello. Marsh held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Go. The order moved swiftly down a chain of command, 12 years in the building, given without hesitation by officers who had drilled for this exact moment so many times in simulation that the real thing felt, for the first strange seconds, almost familiar. Marsh stayed in the command center rather than return to her office, unwilling to watch what came next from anywhere but the room where the decision had been made. If this went wrong, she intended to be there when the news arrived, not somewhere safer, waiting to be told. Within the hour, 60 ships of the Earth Defense Fleet broke from orbit and moved outward to meet an enemy that did not yet know it was about to be met. Guardian-class cruisers formed the heavy center of the formation, their thick hulls built to take a beating that would have crushed anything Earth could build 12 years before. Smaller support ships moved in careful escort around them, carrying supplies, repair crews and backup power for the fleet's shields, and ahead of it all, spread wide in a loose screen meant to scout and strike before the enemy ever saw them coming, flew 6 squadrons of Hawk-class fighters, Captain Mia Torres's squadron among them. Command wants us ahead of the main fleet, Torres told her pilots over the private channel, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. We use the belt. Every rock out here is cover, and cover is something Draxus Corps' people have never had to think about, not against pirates who fight in open space where there's nowhere to hide. You think they've scouted the belt at all? Osei asked from beside her. I think a fleet that's never lost doesn't bother scouting anything, Torres said. That's exactly what we're counting on. The Earth fleet moved through the belt in careful silence, engines running low, hiding their approach behind the natural clutter of rock and ice that filled the space between Mars and Jupiter, a maze that human pilots had spent 12 years training inside, and Concorde pilots had never once needed to learn. Inside her cockpit, Torres watched the rock and ice drift past in the dark, each shadow a possible place for an ambush of her own making, and found her mind returning, uninvited, to every simulation she had flown through these same asteroid fields over 6 years of quiet training. None of those simulations had ever included the particular, cold clarity of knowing that the ships ahead of her carried living crews who fully intended to kill her if given the chance. She pushed the thought aside. There would be time to feel it later, if there was a later. The two fleets found each other on the far side of a wide field of drifting rock, close enough now that neither side could pretend the other did not exist. On the bridge of his flagship, Draxus Corps watched the Earth fleet appear on his sensors, with something between surprise and irritation. They're already here, Kale Doss said, and in formation. That should not be possible at this range without warning. It changes nothing, Corps said. Open a channel. Let us hear what foolishness they intend to offer instead of surrender. But no channel opened from the Earth side. Instead, without a single word of warning, The first wave of Hawk-class fighters broke from behind a drifting cluster of asteroids and struck. Torres led the attack herself, diving her squadron down along the flank of the nearest Concorde cruiser before its shields had even finished calibrating for combat. She fired the moment she had a clean shot. A concentrated burst aimed not at the cruiser's hull, but at the narrow band of exposed systems near its engine housing, a weakness the wreckage from 12 years ago had first revealed, and 12 years of study had confirmed, again and again in simulation. The Concorde cruiser's shields flared bright, held for a moment, and then buckled entirely along the exact point Torres's squadron had targeted. A secondary explosion tore through the engine housing, and the great ship, easily 3 times the size of anything in Torres's squadron, went dark and drifting, its weapons silent, its shields gone. On the Concorde flagship, Drax's Core stared at the display in open disbelief. "That is not possible," he said. "No fighter craft carries a weapon capable of breaking a cruiser's shield in a single pass." "They didn't break the shield everywhere," Kale Doss said grimly, already pulling up the data. "They broke it in one place, a place they clearly already knew to aim for." Core's calm cracked, just slightly, for the first time since the meeting on Vantar Prime. "Order full defensive formation. All ships, return fire on any target in range. I want that fighter squadron destroyed." But the battle had already slipped away from the shape Core expected. Earth's Guardian-class cruisers surged forward from behind the asteroid field, their own shields holding steady under the first exchange of Concorde fire, in a way that made several Concorde gunnery officers check their targeting systems for a fault. The alloys Dr. Singh's teams had spent 12 years perfecting did exactly what 12 years of testing had promised they would do. Across the battlefield, 6 squadrons of Hawk-class fighters used the asteroid field exactly as Torres had planned, darting between cover, striking at engine housings and weapon batteries, then vanishing back into the rock before Concorde gunners could get a clean shot in return. It was a kind of fighting the Concorde fleet had never trained for, precise and patient, rather than the open, direct combat their 1,000 years of unchallenged dominance had taught them to expect. Reyes, flying just off Torres's wing, found her first target within minutes of the engagement beginning, a Concorde support ship attempting to slip past the main fighting to reach the fleet's flank. She hesitated only a moment before locking her weapons and firing, 6 years of training taking over where nerves might otherwise have won. The support ship's shields collapsed under a precise strike to its rear thrusters, leaving it dead in space, harmless. "First kill logged," she reported over the channel, her voice higher than usual but steady. "Copy that," Torres answered. "Stay sharp. It won't be the last chance you get today." Halfway through the engagement, one of Earth's newest weapons came into play for the first time outside a testing range. A wave of specially built support ships, positioned carefully at the edge of the asteroid field, released a coordinated pulse, designed by Dr. Singh's own research team, a burst of directed energy meant to overload unshielded electronics at close range. 3 Concorde ships, caught in the pulse while their shields were focused forward against the main Earth fleet, went dark all at once, their weapons and engines failing together, leaving them drifting and helpless among the rocks. "Systems failure across 3 vessels," Kale Doss reported, his voice tight. "Marshal, this is not the fight we were told to expect." Core said nothing for a long moment, watching his fleet's carefully ordered formation come apart around him, cruisers he had trusted for a decade going dark or falling back in confusion, fighters that should have been an afterthought, tearing gaps in his lines that his own gunners could not close. Not every moment of the battle favored Earth. A Guardian-class cruiser called the Meridian took a direct hit near its forward shield generator, and for a long, terrible minute, its captain fought to keep the ship together as power flickered through its systems and a fire broke out along one damaged deck. Torres, breaking off from her own attack run, brought her squadron in low across the Meridian's hull, drawing Concorde fire away long enough for the ship's crew to bring emergency shielding online and pull the fire under control. It was not a clean rescue. 2 of her pilots took damage doing it, and one, a young man named Aldrin who had trained beside Reyes for years, did not make it back, his fighter torn apart by a lucky shot, just as he pulled clear of the Meridian's hull. There was no time to grieve in the middle of a battle. Torres felt the loss like a blow to the chest, and kept flying, because that was what 12 years of training had built into her, the same as it had built into every pilot in her squadron. By the time the battle had run its course, less than an hour after the first shot, the numbers told a story that would have seemed impossible to anyone in the Concord High Council only a week before. Of the 40 ships Draxus Corps had brought into the solar system, 6 were destroyed outright, 11 more disabled and drifting, their crews already broadcasting distress signals on emergency channels. Earth's fleet had lost 4 fighters and suffered damage across a dozen ships. Serious losses, real losses, the kind that would be mourned in the days ahead, but nothing close to the collapse Corps' confidence had promised his own council. "Marshal," Cale Doss said quietly, "if we continue this engagement, we risk losing the fleet entirely." Draxus Corps sat in silence for a long moment, watching a battle unfold that broke every certainty he had carried since receiving his commission, since his first victory against a pirate captain who had never stood a chance, since every year of his career that had taught him the Concord simply did not lose. "Order a withdrawal," he said finally, the words costing him something he did not have a name for. "Full retreat to the edge of the system. We are not equipped for this fight today." The Concord fleet broke away from the asteroid field and began pulling back, faster than it had approached, its formation ragged where it had once been perfect. Earth's fleet did not pursue far. Ryland's orders were clear: protect the solar system. Do not chase an enemy into open space where reinforcements might be waiting. Let them go, and let them carry the truth of what had happened back to whoever needed to hear it. On the bridge of the horizon, Ryland watched the retreating fleet with no real satisfaction, only a tired, careful relief. "Casualties?" he asked. 4 fighters lost. Damage across the meridian, and 2 other cruisers, came the report. No ships destroyed outright. We held. "We held," Ryland repeated quietly, thinking of the families of 4 pilots who would receive news that night that no victory could soften. Within hours, news of the battle reached every screen on Earth. There was no parade, no wild celebration, not yet. Not with families across the world learning the names of the pilots who would not be coming home. But there was something quieter and, in its own way, stronger. The simple, settling knowledge that when the moment came, humanity had not knelt, had not broken, had stood in the dark against a fleet that had never lost, and had not been the one to fall. Secretary General Marsh addressed the world again that evening, her message shorter this time. "We did not want this fight," she said, "but we were ready for it. Because we chose, 12 years ago, never to be anything less than ready again." Back on Vantar Prime, the message reached the Concord High Council within hours of the retreat, carried across the vast distance by relay stations, built over 10,000 years, for exactly this purpose. High Chancellor Voss Kethrin read the casualty report the same way he had read Earth's first refusal. Once quickly, in disbelief, and then again, slowly, as the truth of it settled into something he could not argue away. 6 ships destroyed. 11 disabled. A fleet under one of the Concord's most decorated young commanders, forced into retreat by a species that had been flying between stars for barely over a decade. Word of the defeat did not stay contained within the High Council chamber. It could not. Within days, it had reached every member world of the Concord, carried by traders, by relay officers, by the simple, unstoppable speed of rumor among 600 star systems that had never once had a story like this to tell. On worlds that had joined the Concord willingly, and worlds that had joined only because resistance had once seemed impossible, people began, quietly and carefully at first, to ask questions they had never thought to ask before. If Earth could stand against the Concord and win, even once, even briefly, what did that mean for everyone else who had always assumed there was no other choice but to kneel? On the world called Ilvan, 300 years a member of the Concord, a young administrator named Roe, who had grown up hearing only that resistance to the Concord was both impossible and unthinkable, read the reports of Earth's battle 3 times before showing them to anyone else. She said nothing about it in public, but that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to wonder what her own world might look like if it had once made a different choice, 12 years, or 100 years, or 300 years ago. High Chancellor Kethrin did not have an answer he was willing to say aloud, but he understood. Sitting alone in his chamber long after the rest of the council had gone, that the small, backward, 12-year-old species called Earth had done something no one else in 10,000 years had ever managed. They had made the Concorde's certainty look, for the very first time, like it might not be certain at all. The Concorde High Council chamber on Vantar Prime had not seen a session this loud in living memory. High Chancellor Voss Kethrin stood at the head of the table, letting the noise run its course, because there was no stopping it until it had. 6 ships lost to a species that has known of the stars for 12 years, Councillor Yarash said, his voice carrying over the others. Every member world will hear of this by the season's end, if they have not already. We cannot allow this insult to stand unanswered for one more day. No one is suggesting it should stand, Kethrin said. The question is how we answer it. With everything we have, Yarash said, send Kor back with 10 times the fleet. Burn their shipyards from orbit. Make certain that whatever story reaches the other worlds ends with Earth's surrender, not their survival. Councillor Wren, who had warned the Council of exactly this danger only a week before, shook her head slowly. And if a larger fleet meets the same fate, what story reaches the other worlds then? It will not, Yarash said flatly. One battle proves nothing, except that Kor underestimated them. He will not make that mistake twice. And this time, he will not arrive with 40 ships hoping to frighten a surrender out of them. He will arrive with enough force that surrender will be the only option left standing. A third voice, quieter than the other two, belonged to Councillor Thessa, who oversaw relations with the Concorde's oldest and most compliant member worlds. There is another risk neither of you has named, she said. If we send an overwhelming fleet and Earth still finds a way to bloody it, we will have proven their strength twice instead of once. Perhaps it would serve us better to end this quietly, before it becomes a story anyone outside this room ever gets to finish hearing. No one answered her directly, though the suggestion hung in the air a moment longer than anyone seemed comfortable with. Kethrin let the argument continue a while longer, though his own mind had already settled the matter before the meeting began. Wren was not wrong to worry, but Yarash was not wrong either, about the deeper danger. Word of Earth's small victory was already moving through the Concorde's 600 worlds faster than any fleet could follow it, and every day that passed without an answer was a day some other world, somewhere, might begin quietly wondering whether kneeling had only ever been a choice, not a certainty. That question, left to grow, would cost the Concorde far more in the end than any fleet ever could. There was also a truth Kethrin did not say aloud, one that pressed on him more than he liked to admit. Councillor Yarash had allies enough on this council to make a chancellor's chair less secure than it had been a month ago, and a chancellor who answered a challenge to Concorde authority with hesitation would not likely keep that chair much longer, whatever the wisdom of hesitation might otherwise have argued for. Summon Fleet Marshal Kor, Kethrin said finally. Draxus Kor arrived within the hour, and if the humiliation of his retreat weighed on him, he did not let it show in front of the council, though something in his bearing had changed since the meeting where he had first volunteered for this task with such easy confidence. You will have a second chance, Marshal, Kethrin said. 150 ships. Every warning we might have offered Earth before, we have now spent. This time, there will be no ultimatum, no single station offered as a demonstration. You will proceed to their homeworld directly, subdue their fleet, and force their surrender by whatever means are necessary. Am I understood? Understood, Chancellor, Kor said. It will not go the same way twice. See that it does not, Kethrin said. For your sake, and for the Concorde's. Afterward, alone with Kale Doss aboard the transport back to his new flagship, Kor allowed himself a rare moment of honesty. They found a weakness we didn't know we had, he said. 12 years old as a species, and they found it in 12 years. I have served the Concorde for 60, and I did not know our own shields carried a gap until a species barely out of its own atmosphere showed me where to look. Doss said nothing for a moment. What will you do differently this time? He asked finally. Everything, Kor said. I underestimated them once, because everything I had ever been taught said I could. I will not make a habit of trusting what I have been taught over what I have seen with my own eyes. Far across the stars from that chamber, on the world called Ilvan, the administrator named Ro had spent the days since Earth's battle, doing something she had never once considered doing, in all her years of quiet, careful service to the Concorde. She had begun, slowly and with great care, to look for a way to reach them. Ro had been born into a Concorde that her own grandmother still remembered joining, back when Ilvan's ships had been burned in orbit, as a lesson before the survivors were offered the same choice Earth had just refused. Her grandmother had never spoken of it as a tragedy, only as the plain, unavoidable cost of survival, and Ro had grown up believing the same, the way a person believes the ground beneath them will hold their weight, without ever once testing it. Earth's battle was the first crack she had ever seen in that ground, and once she had seen it, she found she could not unsee it. It was not simple. Every official channel between Ilvan and the wider Concorde network passed through relay stations that logged and reported every message sent. But Ro's position gave her access to the trade schedules that routed Concorde merchant convoys near the edge of Earth's own solar system, convoys that still ran even now, carrying goods between systems that had no interest in the growing conflict. Buried inside a routine cargo manifest, encoded in a pattern she hoped human engineers were clever enough to notice and unravel, she hid a message and let it travel the ordinary, unremarkable path of a shipment of nothing in particular. It reached Earth 9 days later, flagged by an alert engineer in Dr. Singh's own department, who noticed an irregular pattern buried inside an otherwise unremarkable trade signal intercepted from a passing Concorde convoy. It took the team 2 more days to unravel it fully. The message was short. It identified itself only as coming from someone who wished Earth to survive what was coming. It explained, in careful technical detail, a flaw in the shield modulation pattern used across most Concorde warships, a narrow frequency window during which their shields ran at reduced strength for a fraction of a second as power cycled between forward and rear arrays. A flaw the Concorde itself had never bothered to fix because no enemy in 10,000 years had ever been skilled enough or patient enough to find and strike that window. And at the very end, almost as an afterthought, a single additional line. Not every world under the Concorde's banner wishes to see you kneel. Some of us are watching and hoping, for the first time in a long while, that hope is not foolish. We don't know who sent this, Ryland said, reading the decoded message in the command center with Marsh and Singh beside him. It could be a trick, a way to lure our fleet into a weakness that doesn't exist. It could be, Singh agreed, but the technical detail here is too specific to be a simple trap. Whoever wrote this understands shield engineering at a level that matches what we already suspected about Concorde ship design from the wreckage 12 years ago. I'd like to test it in simulation before we trust it in battle, but I don't think we should dismiss it. Marsh read the final line of the message twice. Whoever they are, she said quietly. They took a real risk sending this. Let's make sure it wasn't wasted. Ryland was quiet for a moment, still turning the message over, as if turning it toward the light might reveal something new. If it's a trap, he said, it's the strangest one I've ever heard of. A trap doesn't usually apologize for what it's about to do to you. Maybe it isn't a trap, Singh said. Maybe it's just what it looks like. Someone out there who's tired of watching worlds like theirs get told there's only one choice. Over the following days, Singh's team ran the frequency data against simulations built from the captured wreckage and the sensor logs of the first battle, and found the pattern held. It was real. Ryland began reworking his fleet's targeting systems around it immediately, training gunners and automated systems alike to watch for that narrow, half-second window and strike the instant it opened. It meant retraining crews who had only just begun to recover from the first battle's losses, running drill after drill until timing the half-second gap became as automatic as breathing. It meant reworking automated targeting systems built over 12 years around an assumption that had just been proven wrong. None of it was simple, and none of it felt entirely ready when the Second Fleet finally came. But it was progress, built in days on top of 12 years of foundation, and progress, Ryland had learned by now, was usually enough, if it arrived before the enemy did. At the same time, Marsh recorded a short message of her own, quiet and simple, addressed not to the Concorde Council, but to whoever among its member worlds might one day hear it. She did not know if it would ever reach anyone. She sent it anyway, tucked into the same kind of ordinary trade channels that had carried Ro's message to Earth, a small act of hope sent back out into the dark in return. 12 days after the first battle, Sensors picked up the new Concorde fleet crossing into the solar system, and this time there was no mistaking its size. 150 ships, spread in a formation built for conquest rather than intimidation, moving with a speed and purpose the first fleet had never shown. It did not slow at the edge of the system. It did not send a warning. It moved directly toward Mars, where Earth's forward colony of nearly 6,000 people sat inside a dome that had never been built to withstand an attack from orbit. Inside that dome, a colony administrator named Priya Nair was in the middle of an ordinary morning, arguing gently with a supplier over a delayed shipment of hydroponic seed stock, when the alert reached her desk. She had grown up on Mars, one of the first generation born under the dome rather than brought there as an adult, and she had never once, in 30 years of life, seriously believed the sky above her could turn dangerous. She read the alert twice, the way people up and down the solar system seemed to keep doing that week, and then began, calmly and quickly, the evacuation procedures her colony had drilled 100 times, without ever quite believing they would be needed. "They're not stopping to make demands this time," Ryland said, watching the formation's course projections update in real time. "They're going straight for Mars. All fleet, full readiness," he ordered. "We meet them at Mars orbit. We do not let that colony come under direct fire." The battle that followed was larger and harder than anything the first engagement had prepared anyone for. 150 Concorde ships against Earth's full defense fleet, reinforced in the days since the first battle with everything the shipyards could finish in time, still smaller in raw numbers but armed now, with Rose's stolen knowledge of the half-second gap in Concorde shielding. Guardian-class cruisers targeted that narrow window with a precision the Concorde had never faced before, and ship after ship staggered under strikes that should not, by every rule the Concorde's engineers had ever trusted, have been possible to land. Osei, flying at Taurus's side as he had for years, caught the rhythm of the frequency gap faster than almost anyone in the fleet, calling out the timing over the squadron channel like a drumbeat the rest of his wing could fly to. "Gap in 3, 2, 1, fire," he said, again and again. Cruisers many times his squadron's combined size buckling under strikes, timed to a half-second window that should have been invisible to anyone who had not been told exactly where to look. It was not enough to win outright, not against a fleet nearly 4 times the size of the one Core had first brought, but it bought Earth's ships time, and time, against a fleet still learning to fear a species it had dismissed only weeks before, turned out to matter more than anyone had dared to promise. But numbers mattered too, and 150 ships were not 40. Earth's fleet took losses far heavier than the first battle. Cruisers crippled, fighter squadrons cut down defending the colony's outer defense platforms, the Meridian, already scarred from the first engagement, finally torn apart under concentrated fire that no single ship could survive twice. Voices crowded every channel at once. Damage reports and course corrections and the clipped, controlled calls of pilots and gunners doing everything they had trained 12 years to do, all at the same time, in the same stretch of dark sky above a planet that had never expected to need defending. Torres, leading her squadron through the thick of it for the second time in 2 weeks, felt the battle tilting in a way the first had never quite threatened to. On his flagship, Core watched the numbers climb far faster than even his most cautious projections had allowed for. 20 ships lost already, twice what the first battle had cost him, and the Earth fleet showed no sign of breaking, only bending, the way something built to bend is supposed to. Kethran's orders had been clear: subdue their fleet, force their surrender, whatever means necessary. Core had not expected, when he accepted those words, to find himself measuring exactly how far necessary could be made to stretch. Then Drax's Core made the decision. Kethran's instructions had given him the authority, but not quite the stomach, to make lightly. "Target the colony dome directly," Core ordered. "One clean strike. Let them see what continued resistance costs, and let their fleet choose between saving their people and saving themselves." Kale Doss relayed the order without argument, though something in his carefully controlled expression suggested he understood exactly what kind of line his commander had just chosen to cross, and did not fully agree it needed crossing. He said nothing about it. There was no time, and perhaps, he told himself, no place for it either, not in the middle of a battle that had already cost more than either of them had expected to pay. On the bridge of the horizon, Ryland received the warning from a Mars orbital sensor station seconds after Kor's flagship began charging a weapon far larger than anything used in the first battle. A weapon with a clear, direct line to the colony dome below. "They're going to fire on the dome," Ryland said, the words landing in the command center like a physical blow. Estimated charge time, 90 seconds. There was no time for a fleet maneuver large enough to matter. Only one option stood any chance at all. "Torres," Ryland's voice cut through her squadron's channel, sharp and immediate. "Your squadron is closest to their flagship. I need that weapon offline in 90 seconds, or I need 6,000 people evacuated from a dome that cannot be evacuated in time. Choose fast, Captain, because I can't choose it for you." Torres did not hesitate. "Copy that, Admiral. Squadron, on me. We're going straight at the flagship." Reyes's voice came over the channel, tight but controlled. "Captain, that ship has to be carrying 20 times our firepower in point defense alone." "Then we'd better fly like it," Torres said. "OC, you're with me on the primary run. Reyes, take the others and keep anything else off our tails. Nobody stops until that weapon is dark." 6 fighters, already battered from an hour of hard fighting, broke formation and turned directly toward the largest, most heavily defended ship in the entire Concorde fleet, racing against a countdown none of them could see, but all of them could feel, while below them, unaware and utterly helpless, 6,000 people on Mars went on with whatever last ordinary minutes they had left, not yet knowing how close the end had just come to finding them. 90 seconds is not a long time. For Captain Mia Torres, driving her fighters straight at the largest warship the Concorde had ever built, it felt both impossibly short and strangely endless, the kind of time that stretched and compressed at once, depending on which part of her mind she listened to. The flagship's point defense turned on them the moment they crossed inside its outer range, a wall of fire thicker than anything Torres had flown through in either battle so far. Reyes's group broke off exactly as ordered, drawing a share of that fire toward themselves, buying Torres and Osei the narrow gap they needed to keep closing. On her display, Torres watched 2 of Reyes's fighters take direct hits, spinning off course but, by some mercy, still intact, their pilots alive and cursing over the open channel as they fought to regain control. There was no time to check on them further. The countdown in the corner of her vision kept falling, indifferent to anything happening around it. 40 seconds, Ryland's voice said over the channel, tight and even. "Copy," Torres said, weaving her fighter through a field of defensive fire that seemed to thicken with every second. Beside her, Osei matched her movement almost perfectly. 6 years of flying together, compressed into a kind of understanding that needed no more words between them. Point defense fire clipped her shield edge once, twice, the impacts jarring through her frame without breaking through. 12 years of shield engineering proving its worth in exactly the way Dr. Singh had always promised it eventually would. "There," Osei said, marking a point along the flagship's hull, where their scans showed the weapon's power conduits running close to the surface, a design flaw no different in principle from the shield gap Rose's message had revealed, the kind of weakness that only showed itself to someone who had learned to look for exactly this sort of thing. 20 seconds. "Everything we've got, on my mark," Torres said. They fired together, twin strikes converging on the same narrow stretch of hull at nearly point-blank range. The flagship's shields, already strained from absorbing the frequency-timed strikes, hammering it from the wider battle, buckled at exactly the point Osei had marked. Torres felt her fighter rock hard from the return fire that followed, alarms screaming across her console, but she held her course a fraction of a second longer, long enough to see the strike connect. The weapon's massive charge, built up over 90 seconds toward a single, devastating release, found nowhere left to go. It fed back through damaged conduits into the flagship's own systems, and for one bright, terrible moment, the largest ship in the Concorde fleet lit up from within, power cascading through decks never built to hold it, before every system aboard, weapons, shields, and engines alike, went dark all at once. "Weapon is down," Osei reported, his voice shaking with something between exhaustion and disbelief. "Colony Dome is safe." On the bridge of the horizon, Ryland let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Copy that, Torres. Get your squadron clear. You did it." Aboard his own crippled flagship, Drax's core stood in the sudden dark of failed emergency lighting, listening to Kale Doss read out the damage report by the glow of a handheld light, and understood, in a way he had not quite allowed himself to understand after the first battle, that something fundamental had shifted beneath his feet. 6 fighters, 6 small, fragile fighters had found their way to the heart of his fleet's greatest ship and broken it, not through overwhelming force, but through the same patient, precise understanding of weakness that had cost him 6 ships in the asteroid belt 2 weeks before. He thought, briefly and uselessly, of the confidence he had carried into the council chamber 2 weeks earlier, promising a swift and easy surrender within the month. He had believed it completely at the time. He was no longer certain he would ever again feel that particular kind of certainty about anything. Around his crippled flagship, the wider battle was already turning further against him. Ships that had held formation through the worst of the fighting broke and scattered as word of the flagship's fall spread across the fleet's channels. And Kor understood that whatever authority his rank carried, it would not hold a fleet together through a moment like this one. "Order the withdrawal," Kor said quietly. "All ships still able to move. We are finished here." Before his own communications failed entirely, he opened a single channel, unasked, toward the Earth Fleet's flagship. "Admiral Ryland," Kor said, his voice carrying none of the certainty it had held 2 weeks earlier. "Your Captain Torres flies well. I have commanded fleets for 60 years, and I have never seen a strike run executed with such precision against such defenses. Whatever else comes of this war, know that it was not luck that beat me today." Ryland considered his answer for a moment before giving it. "It wasn't luck for either side, Marshal. Your people fought hard too. I hope the next time we speak, it isn't across a battlefield." Kor said nothing further, and the channel closed as the last of his fleet's ships gathered what power they had left and began the long retreat back toward the edge of the solar system, leaving behind 18 destroyed ships, dozens more disabled, and a flagship that would need to be towed the entire way home. The news reached Vantar Prime 3 days later, and this time, High Chancellor Voss Kethrin did not need to read the report twice to understand its weight. 18 ships destroyed, the flagship crippled by a squadron of 6 fighters, a fleet nearly 4 times the size of the first, defeated more completely than the first had ever been. Across the Concord's 600 worlds, the story spread in 100 different versions within days, embellished here, softened there, but never quite losing the single, unavoidable fact at its center. A species less than 2 decades into the stars had now defeated Concord fleets not once, but twice, the second time crippling the flagship of one of the Concord's most decorated commanders in the process. The council chamber, when it convened, was quieter than it had been after the first defeat. There was no shouting this time, only a heavy, uncertain silence that Councillor Yarash was the first to break. "Send a 3rd fleet," he said, though something in his voice had lost the certainty it carried 2 weeks before. 10 times what we sent this time. Enough that no strategy, no weakness, no clever pilot can matter against it." "And if that fleet fails as well?" Councillor Thessa asked quietly. "How many ships are you prepared to lose, Yarash, before you admit that this species has already answered the only question that matters?" "They are not weak. They were never weak. We simply never troubled ourselves to notice." Yarash opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, and for the first time in the many years the two of them had sat across this table from one another, Kethrin watched him choose silence over certainty. It was, in its own small way, as remarkable as anything that had happened at Earth. Kethrin let the silence stretch a moment longer before he spoke. "There is something else you should both know," he said. "Reports have reached me from 3 separate member worlds this week alone, each asking, through careful and indirect channels, what exactly happened at Earth, and what it might mean for worlds who have wondered, quietly, for centuries, whether the terms of their own membership were as unavoidable as they were once told." On the world called Ilvan, that same week, Ro received word of Earth's second victory through the same trade channels she had once used to send her own message outward. She read it standing in her office window, looking out over a city that had lived under careful, unquestioned Concord rule for 300 years, and for the first time in her life, she said something aloud to a colleague that she would once never have dared to say at all. "Perhaps it is worth asking," she said quietly. What our own world might become, if it ever decided to ask the same question Earth did. Her colleague did not answer at first, glancing instinctively toward the door, the way people raised under careful rule, learned to do without ever quite deciding to. But he did not report her either, and that, in its own quiet way, was its own kind of answer. Word of that small, quiet exchange did not stay contained to a single office window. It moved the way such things always did on Ilvan, carefully, in whispers, between people who had learned across 3 centuries exactly how much could be said aloud, and how much could only be said in silence. Ro did not know, and would not know for some time, how many other conversations like hers were happening across her world that same week. But there were more of them than anyone watching from Vantar Prime yet understood. Back on Vantar Prime, Kethron made the decision that Counselor Thessa had been urging since before the Second Fleet had even departed. "We will not send a third fleet," he said. "We will send an offer. A real one this time, negotiated as equals, not delivered as a demand, dressed in the language of protection. Whatever pride that costs this council, it costs less than a war we cannot promise to win, fought against a species that has already twice proven it can hurt us badly enough to matter." The message that reached Earth 3 days later bore little resemblance to the one envoy Thal Saren had delivered weeks before. It came directly from High Chancellor Kethron himself, addressed to Secretary General Marsh, requesting formal negotiations between equals, with no conditions attached beyond a willingness to talk. Marsh, Ryland, and Singh met with Kethron's representatives 3 weeks later, the negotiations carried out carefully across the distance that still separated their 2 systems, translated word by word, term by term. Among Kethron's negotiators, displayed on the same shared screen, Marsh recognized Envoy Thal Saren, the same official who had delivered the Concord's first offer months before. He said little throughout the talks, but near their close, he addressed her directly for the first time since that first, fateful refusal. "You told me once that no species in 10,000 years had said no to the Concord," Marsh said. "I did," Thal Saren admitted. "I did not expect, when I said it, that I was describing the last time it would ever be true. Earth would not join the Concord. There would be no oversight of its fleets, no tribute of resources, no limit placed on what humanity chose to build. In exchange, Earth offered honest trade, an open door for genuine cooperation between equals, and something Marsh insisted on personally, over the quiet objections of several of her own council, a guarantee, written into the agreement itself, that no member world of the Concord would face punishment for any sympathy shown toward Earth during the conflict, named or unnamed. The hardest point of negotiation had nothing to do with fleets or resources at all. Kethran's representatives pushed hard against that amnesty clause, arguing that internal Concord matters were the Concord's alone to decide. Marsh held her ground. "You came to us offering protection," she said, through the long delay that stretched between every exchange across the distance, separating their 2 systems. "We are only asking that you extend a little of that same protection to your own people, the ones who took a risk hoping we would win. If that price is too high for peace, then perhaps peace was never truly what you were offering to begin with." Kethron agreed to that final term without much argument, and Marsh suspected, though she never asked directly, that he understood exactly who and what she was protecting. The peace was signed on a quiet morning 19 days later, in a small chamber inside the same council building where Marsh had first delivered Earth's refusal months before. There were no parades, no great speeches, no crowds gathered outside to watch, only a single shared screen carrying Kethran's image across the distance, and the quiet, careful signatures of 2 civilizations agreeing, at last, to treat one another as equals rather than as master and subject. Marsh signed first, then waited the long, familiar delay for Kethran's own signature to arrive from across the stars, a silence that felt, for the first time in months, like patience rather than dread. Dr. Amara Singh watched the signing from the command center, rather than in person, standing quietly beside Ryland, as the final signatures were exchanged across the screen. 12 years, she said. I used to wonder some nights whether we were building all of it for nothing, whether the day would simply never come. It came, Ryland said, and it found us ready. That's the only part that was ever really up to us. That evening, Secretary General Marsh addressed the people of Earth one final time on the matter. 3 months ago, she said, the galaxy arrived at our door and asked us to kneel. We chose, instead, to stand, because we had spent 12 quiet years building the strength to make that choice mean something. We did not win because we were stronger than every other power among the stars. We won because we were ready, because we stood together instead of apart, and because being ready and standing together turned out to matter more than size ever could. I hope, wherever this story is heard next, among whatever people, on whatever world, that it reminds them of the same thing it has reminded us, that no people are as small as the ones who have never yet been tested believe themselves to be. On the deck of the Horizon, Captain Mia Torres stood beside Osei and Reyes, watching the last of the Concorde's diplomatic ships depart the solar system under peaceful escort rather than under fire. She thought of Aldrin, who had not lived to see this morning, and of the 200 people on Ceres 7 and the 6,000 on Mars, who had. Osei stood quietly beside them both, saying little, the way he usually did, though Torres had long since learned that his silences carried as much weight as anyone else's words. Somewhere below them, on a planet that had spent 12 secret years preparing for a war it hoped it would never have to fight, people were already beginning to imagine what peacetime might look like, a kind of imagining none of them had allowed themselves to do in months. Feels strange, Reyes said quietly, having nothing to fight anymore. Get used to it, Torres said. That was the whole point. On Ceres 7, Station Chief Naomi Bell allowed her people out of the shielded core they had once huddled inside during the first battle's opening hours, and for the first time in months, the drills that had shaped so much of daily life on the station felt, however briefly, like something belonging to the past, rather than a warning of what still might come. Far beyond the solar system, word of Earth's stand continued to travel outward, from trade route to trade route, from world to world, carried by the same slow, unstoppable current of rumor that had once carried news of the Concorde's endless, unbroken dominance. On countless worlds under Concorde rule, people who had never once questioned the shape of their own lives began, quietly and carefully, to ask themselves the same question Ro had asked aloud in her office window on Ilvan. What might become possible if a people simply decided to stand? On a mining world called Keshardai, 3 jumps from Ilvan, a foreman who had spent 30 years enforcing Concorde quotas without ever once questioning them, found himself, that same season, quietly setting aside a little more of his world's harvest for its own people than the ledgers technically allowed, telling himself it was an accounting error, knowing, in some quiet corner of his mind, that it was not. Small acts, none of them loud enough to draw attention, none of them large enough to be called rebellion, but there were more of them, that season, than there had been in the 300 years before it. Earth had not set out to start a revolution among the stars. It had only ever wanted to remain itself, free and unclaimed, on its own quiet corner of the galaxy. But sometimes, humanity would learn in the years that followed, the simple act of refusing to kneel was enough to change everything, not only for the one who refused, but for every other eye that happened to be watching when they did.